The advertisement had been folded into the back pages of the Winnipeg Free Press, between a notice for milled lumber and one for a lost gray gelding, as if the man who placed it had not wanted it to stand out too much. She had read it 3 times in the kitchen of the house where she had been taking in boarders since the previous autumn. The window above the sink faced north and gave nothing in the way of light, and the kitchen smelled of other people's meals. She had been there 11 months. Before that, a cousin's house in Brandon where she had gone after the accident on the river. Before that, a life she did not spend much time thinking about anymore. The advertisement said he had a wheat farm east of Prairie, good land, section and a half, a house with a proper foundation, and a need for someone capable and steady. He had written capable and steady like a man who had already been through something that taught him what those words actually meant. She wrote back the same evening. She did not write warmly. She wrote accurately. She said she was 29 years old, that she had grown up on a mixed farm north of Dauphin, that she could keep accounts, manage a kitchen, work outside in cold weather without complaint, and that she was not looking for anything other than what the advertisement offered. His reply came in 8 days. It was shorter than hers. He said that was fine, and when could she come? She arrived on a Thursday in early April, when the snow had pulled back from the fields but not yet let go of the low ground, so the ditches along the road still held gray ice, and the fields on either side of the track looked like they were waiting to be told what season it was. A man met her at the portage station with a wagon. He was not the man from the advertisement. He was older, with a beard gone mostly white, and a way of moving that said his hips had made a decision separate from his intentions. He said his name was Dougal, that he worked the north section, and that the man she was looking for had stayed back to deal with something in the granary. She put her bag in the wagon and climbed up without waiting to be helped. Dougal noted that and said nothing about it. The farm was about 6 miles out. She watched the land the whole way. The fields had been worked in the fall, the furrows still visible under the last of the frost, and whoever had done it had been careful about direction, reading the slope, keeping the rows angled to hold the spring runoff rather than let it sheet off the side. She noticed that. It was the kind of care that didn't show off, the kind that saved the topsoil year after year without anyone remarking on it. The yard came into view around a long curve of windbreak, a double row of Manitoba maples, most of them old enough that they had grown together at the canopy and made a tunnel of bare branches against the white sky. The house was square and plain, unpainted but solid. A kitchen garden space beside it, still under straw mulch. A barn that looked like it had been built in sections over time, each addition slightly different from the last, but none of it negligent. A granary, a machine shed, a second outbuilding she couldn't name from the road. The man came out of the granary when the wagon rolled in. He was taller than she had expected, lean in the way of men who didn't carry extra weight because there was too much work to let it accumulate. He was perhaps 35 or he was perhaps 42, it was hard to say. His face was the kind that outdoor work made ageless in a particular way, the features settled and sun-red, the eyes careful. He had taken his hat off when he stepped out, which she filed away without deciding what to do with it. He looked at her directly, not assessing her the way she had been assessed before by men in new situations, more the way you look at a field you have not walked yet, with attention that is trying to be accurate. He said, "The granary floors rotted through in the northeast corner. I didn't want to leave it." She said, "How bad?" He said, "Bad enough I'm going to lose grain if I don't deal with it before seeding." She said, "Do you have planking?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said he had some in the shed. She nodded. He put his hat back on. Dougal carried her bag inside. The house was cold in the way of a house where the fire had only been laid for practical hours and not for comfort. The kitchen was larger than she'd expected and reasonably organized. Dishes stacked, a wood box that needed filling, a stovetop with the particular dull sheen of cast iron that had been cleaned but not seasoned in some time. She found the wood box outside the back door and filled it herself. She laid the fire and had the stove warming before the 2 men came in from the granary. They ate. She had found a heel of bread, salt pork, potatoes that had wintered well, and a jar of pickled beets someone had put up the previous fall. She made do. When she set the food on the table, Dougal looked at it the way a man looks at something he had not expected. She said, "There are more beets if you want them." He said, "I wouldn't say no." The man ate without speaking. He ate methodically. The way people do when eating has been a matter of fuel rather than pleasure for long enough that the habit has become permanent. When he finished, he set his fork down and said, "The room is off the back hall. There's a proper door. The stovepipe runs through the wall so it keeps the heat." She said she would look at it after supper. He said, "Seeding starts in 3 weeks if the ground cooperates. I've got 2 sections to put in and Dougal's knee isn't." He stopped. Dougal said without looking up, "My knee is fine, your knee is not fine." There was a silence that had the shape of an old argument. She said, "What are you putting in?" He said, "Red typh, mostly. Some oats on the low quarter." She said, "What does the low quarter do in a wet spring?" He said, "Holds water longer than I want it to." She said, "You could drain it." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been putting aside because there were always 15 other things ahead of it, not arguing against it, just acknowledging the distance between knowing and doing. She said, "If you have tile, it's a 2-week job before the ground firms up." He was quiet. Then he said, "I have some tile." She said, "Then we have 3 weeks." Dougal looked across the table at her without expression. She turned back to the stove and poured herself a second cup of tea. The room off the back hall was small and held the cold of the outside wall, but the stovepipe ran through the corner the way he had said, and she could see by the scorch marks on the plaster that it worked. A cot, a window that faced east, a shelf. She stood in it for a moment after setting her bag down, listening to the house. She could hear the men talking low in the kitchen, the particular register of 2 people who have been in the same difficult situation long enough that their voices had learned each other's cadences. She sat on the edge of the cot. Outside the east window, the sky had gone the deep blue of a prairie evening in April, too cold still to be spring, too light to be winter, that uncertain time when the land was deciding something. She was 29 years old. She had been 25 when her husband went through the ice on the Assiniboine, late March, a crossing he had made 100 times before. She had spent the years since becoming very efficient about most things and very quiet about others. She had not expected to be here. She had not expected a lot of things. But the letter had been plain, and the man's hands when he carried the stove wood had been the hands of someone who worked without resentment. And the furrows in the fields had been cut at exactly the right angle to hold the runoff. She had learned to pay attention to the things people did when they thought no one was looking. In the morning, she woke before light and lay still for a moment in the dark of the small room, listening. The house was quiet. Outside, wind moved through the maple windbreak in long, low passes. She dressed and went to the kitchen and built the fire. She found rolled oats and dried apples and made porridge and had coffee on before the sun was fully above the tree line. He came in at first light, his boots wet from the yard. He saw the stove going and stopped. He said nothing. He hung his coat and sat down, and she put the coffee in front of him, and he looked at it and then at her and said, "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know." He drank the coffee. After a moment he said, "The ground's thawed in the south field. We can start the tile trench this morning if Dougal's knee holds," she said. "I can run the trenching spade," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I know what I said." He looked at her again with that same careful attention. Then he said, "All right." Dougal's knee, as it turned out, held well enough for directing and worse than that for digging. He stood at the edge of the trench with his arms crossed and his opinions about the grade and the angle, which were largely correct. And she and the man did the actual work in shifts, one digging while the other laid the tile and packed the joint with clay. She had done this work once before, helping her father when she was perhaps 12, and the body remembered it the way bodies remember things they learned early. The spade angle, the rhythm, how to read the soil for change in drainage capacity. At noon she straightened and looked north along the length of what they'd put in, maybe 60 yards, the pale clay tile disappearing into the opened earth at regular intervals. He was watching her. She didn't look over. She said, "You'll pick up another 8 bushels per acre on this quarter if the tile holds," he said. "I know the math," she said. "Then you know why it needed doing." He said, "Yes." She went back to digging. By the 3rd day, Dougal had stopped pretending his knee was anything other than what it was and began spending his afternoons in the machine shed overhauling the seed drill, which, it turned out, badly needed it. She could hear him in there most of the afternoon, the particular sound of a man disassembling something carefully. On the fourth day, she found a problem. About 40 yards into the second trench line, the soil changed character, going from the dark clay loam of the main field to something grittier, more compressed, a layer of old glacial till that would not drain in the same way. She stopped and crouched and turned the soil in her hand and held it to the light. He was at the other end of the line, backfilling. She called to him and he came. He crouched beside her and looked at the soil and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That runs east about 30 yards and then it stops near as I can tell. My father hit it when he was putting in fence posts." She said, "How far down?" He said, 2 feet, maybe 2.5. She thought for a moment. She said, "If we angle the line south here, come around the edge of the till, we can tie back in to the main line near the gate. It adds maybe 20 yards of tile, but you don't lose the drainage." He looked at where she was pointing. He looked at the grade of the field. He said slowly, "That would work." She said, "I know it would work. I'm telling you the plan." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. He stood up and went to get the steaks. They ate supper late that night. She had found flour and put together a pan bread, and there were leftover beans from the night before, and Dougal produced from somewhere a tin of sardines he had been apparently saving for a reason he did not disclose. And they ate that way, the three of them, tired in the clean way that work produces, the particular silence of people who have spent the day solving something together. Dougal said, after a while, "The drill's good. I found the trouble in the second wheel. One of the seed plates was worn down past the stop. I've got a spare that'll do until we can order proper," she said. "When did you last true the frame?" Dougal said, "Before you were born, probably." She said, "I'll look at it tomorrow." He looked at her. Then he looked at the man across the table. The man was eating and not looking at either of them, but she noticed the set of his shoulders had changed. The particular kind of not looking that meant paying close attention. Seeding started on a Tuesday 2 days later than they'd hoped because the north end of the south field needed one more dry day to firm up enough for the drill. She used the morning to put the kitchen in better order than it had been, not reorganizing anything arbitrarily but moving things to where they were most likely to be needed. The kinds of adjustments that come from watching how a space is actually used rather than how someone originally intended it to be used. She moved the flour bin to the shelf directly above the work surface. She restacked the firewood so the driest pieces were to the front. She found a jar of rendered lard that had gone off and dealt with it. When he came in for the noon meal, he stopped inside the door as he usually did, but this time he looked around the kitchen differently, the way you look at something when you sense it's changed and can't immediately say how. He said, "You moved things." She said, "The flour was in the corner where you couldn't reach it without stepping around the table." He said, "I've been doing that for 3 years." She said, "I know. The floor's worn in a curve where you turned." He was quiet. Seeding took 9 days. The weather held, which Dougal said was the first time in several years it had done that without requiring something from them in exchange. She ran the supply wagon, keeping the seed drill topped up so neither man had to stop the passes for resupply, and she managed the books each evening, updating the acreage record and the seed rate and the fuel use in the ledger she had found in the desk off the parlor, a ledger that had been kept erratically before she got to it. Entries made in several different handwritings, across several different years, some months missing entirely. She did not comment on this. She simply started from the current date and worked forward with accuracy. And when she needed to backfill historical numbers, she worked from the receipts she found in a tin box under the desk, receipts going back 8 years, kept but never organized, a kind of savings account of information that had never been drawn on. On the 6th day of seeding, she rode out to the field with the noon meal. The day was warm enough that the ice had finally gone from the north-facing ditches, and the smell of the soil had changed to something mineral and living, the particular smell of a prairie field in true spring that she had not smelled since, before everything changed. She stopped the wagon at the headland and watched him bring the drill around. He handled the horses without much visible effort, the kind of relationship with working animals that takes years and doesn't announce itself. She had driven a team since she was 9 years old, and she recognized that ease. It was not the same as talent. It was more like long acquaintance. He pulled up and she handed him the water first, and he drank it and looked out at the field. It was one of those prairie days that are so large and quiet they seem to stop time. The sky went from pale blue at the horizon to something almost colorless overhead, and the field opened out in both directions, the turned earth dark against the old pale grass at the borders. He said, without looking at her, "My wife grew up in the city, Toronto. She came out here because she thought she would like it," she said. "Did she?" he said. "The first summer, maybe. After that, it was hard for her." She said nothing. He handed the water back. He said, "She left in the fall of 18, took the children east to her mother's, said she'd come back in the spring." He looked down at his hands on the reins. "She sent a letter in March, said she wouldn't." She said, "How old are the children?" He said, "Emmett's 8 now," said their names plainly, the way a man says the names of things he has made peace with missing. "They write when her mother helps them with it." She said, "That's something." He said, "Yes." A pair of crows had landed at the far end of the last pass and were walking the turned earth, picking. She watched them for a moment. She said, "The tile line's holding. You can see it in how the headland is draining." He looked at the far corner of the field where she was looking. The soil at the low end was dark but not standing water, which in a previous spring it would have been. He said, "Yes." And then, after a moment, "Thank you," she said. "You were going to do it eventually." He said, "Probably not this year." She gathered the cloth from the meal and put it back in the basket. She picked up the reins. He did not move immediately, just stayed with his hands on his own reins and looked at the field the way a man looks at something that is beginning to become what he had hoped it would be. She drove back to the yard. That evening she was at the desk with the ledger, when Dougal appeared in the doorway with his hat in both hands, which she had come to understand was how he stood when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. He said, "You know anything about machinery? The reaper's got a problem with the pitman arm that'll cost us when haying comes," she said. "I know enough. I'll look at it this week." He nodded. He turned to go. Then he turned back and said, "He's a decent man," she said. "I know he is." Dougal nodded again, put his hat on and left. The reaper's pitman arm turned out to be a cracked crank pin that had been repaired before with wire in a way that had held longer than it should have and given out at the worst possible time of the previous season. She found this on a Thursday afternoon, lying on her back under the machine in the shed, the light coming in low and yellow from the open door. She could hear the horses in the corral and somewhere farther off, a meadowlark doing the kind of insistent advertising that meadowlarks do in May when the world is warming up and they feel strongly about it. She knew what she needed. She told him at supper. He said, "I can order the pin from Portage, 2-3 days." She said, "Order 2, the second one's showing where." He wrote it down. She had not intended to stay as long as she had. When she had answered the advertisement, she had thought in terms of a season, perhaps 2, a practical arrangement for practical people. She was aware that this was still what it was. She was aware also that the kitchen had begun to feel like a kitchen she knew, and that the sound of the horses in the morning had become one of the sounds she listened for before she got up, and that she had started noticing when he was tired before he said anything about it. She was not sure what to do with that. She put it on the same shelf where she kept other things she was not ready to look at directly and went back to the ledger. The crank pin arrived on a Monday. She installed it herself with Dougal handing tools from a milking stool because his knee had finally made a firm decision about kneeling on concrete floors. She trued the pitman stroke with a piece of baling wire bent to the right gauge, a trick her father had shown her that she had not thought of in years until she needed it. When she came out of the shed, wiping her hands on a rag, he was in the yard watching. He said, "How does it feel?" She said, "It feels like a new pin. You'll know for certain when you run it." He said, "I'll run it Friday." She nodded and went inside. There was a morning in June when she found him at the kitchen table before she was up, which had not happened before. He was not drinking coffee. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, and a letter in front of him, and the particular stillness of a man who has just read something that has changed the dimensions of the room. She built that the fire was saying anything. She put the kettle on. She did not look at the letter. After a while, he said, "Her mother has died. She's asking about coming back." She said nothing. She kept her eyes on the stove. He said, "She says she would like to try again." She said, "What do you want?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the kettle began to sound. He said, "I don't know what I want. I know what would be fair." She poured the water. She set a cup in front of him. She went to the window and looked out at the yard. The morning was clear, the kind that happened in June when the spring had gone exactly right, the green so saturated it looked like it was lit from underneath. The rows of young wheat visible in the south field, even and true, the tile drain doing its work silently under the earth, she said. "What would be fair to the children might not be the same thing as what would be fair to you," he said. "No," she said, "and neither of those is the same as what would be the truth." He was quiet again. She turned from the window. She said, "I can't tell you what to do. I can tell you what I see, which is a farm that is solvent now when it wasn't before, and grain in the ground that is going to come in better than last year, and books that are in order, and a tile drain that will hold another 20 years. She stopped. "That's what's here. Whatever you decide, that part stays." He looked at her. His expression was not one she had a name for. It was not grief, and it was not hope, and it was not gratitude, or it was all of those at once, and they canceled each other out into something quieter. He said, "She wrote to the children, too." Emmett wrote back on his own this time. He didn't need his grandmother's help. She said, "Good." She took her cup to the table and sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the morning light coming through the east window, the same light that came in through her room window and woke her every day now, the light she had come to count on. She was 29 years old. She did not know what the next season would look like. She had stopped needing to. In September, the wheat came off well. Better than the previous 2 years by a count she had made herself and entered in the ledger with no comment beyond the numbers, because the numbers said everything that needed saying. She managed the delivery schedule for the elevator and negotiated the grade with the agent, a man named Dobie, who tried once to talk around her and did not try it again. Dougal drove the first load himself, his knee having improved enough for the wagon seat, and came back with a report on prices and a bag of peppermints from the store in Portage that he distributed without ceremony at the supper table. The letter back to his wife had taken him 3 days to write. She did not read it. She knew only that he had sent it, and that the reply had come 2 weeks later, and that after he read it he had seemed, in some way she could not precisely locate, less like a man carrying a weight he had gotten used to, and more like a man who had set it down somewhere, and was still figuring out how to hold himself upright without it. He did not explain. She did not ask. That was the economy of the place, and she had learned it thoroughly. On an evening in October, when the harvest was in and the books were closed for the season, and the first frost had taken the last of the kitchen garden, she was sitting on the back step with a cup of tea when he came around from the barn. He stopped at the corner of the house and looked at her, and then looked at the step beside her, and then looked at her again. She moved to one side of the step. He sat down. The sun went out flat and orange over the western fields, and the windbreak maples had gone yellow, the last of them bright against the gray of the coming evening. A flock of snow geese crossed far overhead in a long, ragged V, going south ahead of what was coming. Neither of them spoke for a while. She drank her tea. He sat with his forearms on his knees and watched the geese until they were gone. He said, "She's not coming back." She decided definitely. She said, "Are you all right?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. He said, "I think so. I think I've known for a while." She nodded. The geese were gone. The sky went on deepening. The wheat stubble in the south field caught the last light and held it a moment longer than everything else. He said, "I'd like you to stay. Not just for the work." She said nothing for a moment. She looked at the field. She said, "I know." He said, "And?" She said, "I'm already here." She drank the rest of her tea. The last of the light went from the stubble. Somewhere in the windbreak a white-throated sparrow gave its call, the one that sounded like it was asking a question it did not expect answered. They stayed on the step until the cold came in, and the stars began to show above the dark line of the trees, and the yard was quiet, and the wheat was in, and everything that needed doing had been done.